If you want to learn how to move Hitfilm's camera realistically, then you're in luck. Because that's what we're talking about today. In the first part of our camera tutorial, we explored the virtual lens of the Hitfilm camera with a special focus on how to match Hitfilm's lens to the lens of a real-world camera. In the second part of our camera tutorial, we looked at how to move Hitfilm's camera directly and then took a special look at Euler rotation and how the rotation order and how that pertains to Hitfilm's camera can make it difficult to simulate some real-world situations. In this third part of our camera tutorial, we will look at some advanced point rigs designed to simulate gimbals, jibs, and other advanced camera movement solutions. I'm Mike Miller from Tri-M Visual, and this is Advanced Camera Rigging in Hitfilm. And here we are in Hitfilm Pro 2017. We've updated our little 2.5D world from the last tutorial. That's why we're working in Hitfilm Pro 2017. It was easier to set this up using a particle simulator. However, everything we discuss in this tutorial will work in Hitfilm Express. The first key to creating custom camera rigs in Hitfilm is to master the tripod head or yoke rig setup. This was discussed in detail in part 2 of the camera tutorial, so I will just set up the yoke rig quickly without going into too much detail. First, I will select my default camera, which has been named 35mm camera because it's a 35mm equivalent camera. I will create a new point layer, make it 3D, and we'll go ahead and rename this to X-Tilt. I'm going to temporarily parent that to the camera. Move it to the same location. The scale for this scene is set up for 100 pixels equaling 1 foot. At 100 pixels per foot, each inch is roughly 8 pixels. I want the pivot point to be about 2 inches below the camera, like on a real tripod head, so I'm going to set the position of X-Tilt to -16. I'll duplicate X-Tilt, name the duplicate Y-Pan, grab X-Tilt and Y-Pan and move them underneath my 35mm camera. I need to change the parenting setup here by parenting the 35mm camera to X-Tilt, and X-Tilt parents to Y-Pan. As a reminder, Y-Pan is set up to animate only on the Y-axis. The X-Tilt point is set up to rotate only on the X-axis. By manipulating these 2 points together, we break the fixed XYZ rotation Euler order of Hitfilm's default camera, allowing us to control this camera correctly like a realistic camera tripod head. Before we move on, let's compare how a nodal tripod head works versus a video tripod head versus directly rotating the camera. A nodal tripod head is usually used by panoramic photographers. A nodal tripod head is designed so that the camera itself rotates around its own image plane. This reduces any minor parallaxing within the camera as it rotates. A video or photo tripod head, like shown on the upper right, would have the rotation point somewhat below the body of the camera. And as you watch the nodal tripod head and video tripod head moving on the same axes for the same distance at the exact same time, you'll see that the video tripod head camera is drifting in space a little bit because its X-tilt point is below the camera body. Below that, for comparison, labeled direct rotation, is a camera not connected to an X and Y point rig. The camera itself is being rotated. And as the 3 cameras rotate, you can see how the direct rotation camera is skewing and tilting, unlike a camera on a real tripod. This is where in the prior episode we were correcting the Z rotation on our camera to bring it back into line. When rigging up a virtual tripod head on the Hitfilm camera, it's up to you whether to make it a nodal tripod head or whether you want to make it more like a video tripod head. It all depends on the look you're trying to achieve. For some of the examples later on in this tutorial, most notably the jib or the crane, I would put the X-tilt point below the camera body, rigging it like a video tripod head. On the other hand, if I were trying to simulate a handheld gimbal or a drone, then I would want the yoke rig set up nodally around the center of the camera's rotation. Enough about yoke rigs, let's get on to the fun stuff. Next, we'll take a look at doing a slider dolly. A slider dolly is very simply a set of rails that restrict the camera to a single axis of motion. We've already got our camera set up with its X-tilt and Y-pan points. We'll just duplicate the Y-pan point one more time and name that camera move point. I'll take the camera move point and adjust its position so that it's at -600 on the Y-axis. This puts it even with the ground. It's not necessary to put a move point on the ground plane, but I like to do it. In this particular setup, the ground is a single flat plane and doesn't have any dips, valleys, or rises. But in a more complex scene, where a ground object might actually have some up and down rises to it, having the ground point locked to the level of the ground makes it a lot easier to adjust the camera motions to match the ground. We'll take the Y-pan point and parent that to the camera move point. And that's really it. A slider dolly moves in a straight line. So all I would do to animate this is set 2 keyframes and simply move the move point from point A to point B. So easy, I won't even show a demo animation. Let's move on to our next camera type, the circle dolly or skate dolly. Circle dollies are similar to regular slider dollies, except the track is curved, as opposed to a skater dolly, which has a miniature mount with wheels on it designed to arc the camera in a circle. And to create our circle dolly, we're going to keep our camera, its X-tilt, our Y-pan, and our camera move point, and I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate the camera move point and name that circle pivot. We'll open up the transform properties for the circle pivot point and change its position to... Actually, I'll make that -500. Why not? Since I can see the circle pivot point here on the ground plane, I'm going to go ahead and move that and decide that I want to circle roughly around this tree. So I'll just slide that back and parent the camera move point to the circle pivot. To get my circular pivot motion, all I need to do is change the Y rotation on the circle pivot, and the camera will move with it. The next type of camera we want to look at is called a Snorri cam. A Snorri cam is a trademarked name for a specific type of body-rigged camera. A Snorri cam, or body mount rig, is attached to an actor with the camera facing the actor. In Hitfilm, this is very easy to set up. I'm going to go ahead and create a new camera layer, and I'm going to name this Snorri cam. I'll parent the Snorri cam to the airplane object. Come to the transform properties and change these position properties. I'll set X to 0, Y to 0, and I'll go ahead and set the Z value to -3500. And that really is it for a Snorri cam rig. You simply parent your camera to the moving object you want to track in the scene. This particular angle isn't wonderful for our Snorri cam, because we can't see anything other than this airplane object, which is moving, but we can't see any of the ground plane. Let's move our Snorri cam to a new position. We'll change the Z position to 0. We'll change the Y position to 3500. And we'll rotate the camera 90 degrees. Now, as we drag the playhead through the composite shot timeline, we can see that the camera stays locked to our plane object as our airplane flies over the rest of our ground scene. The next type of camera rig I want to discuss is something that I used to call a gimbal rig. But these days, when people think of gimbals and cameras, they think of those little computer-controlled handheld things that you cart around with a camera balanced on an auto-leveling platform. So instead, we're going to call this a selfie stick. To create our selfie stick, we'll actually keep our Snorri cam and modify that. I'm going to move the Snorri cam back to a position of 0, 0, negative 3500, and change its X rotation back to 0. This gives us a camera that is aligned with the right edge of our airplane object. The next step is to create a yoke rig inside our airplane. I'll do this by creating a new point layer, which I'll rename Selfie X Tilt. I'll make this a 3D point, parent it to the airplane, and set its position to 0, 0, 0. I'll go ahead and duplicate Selfie X Tilt and rename the duplicate Selfie Y Pan. I'll move my existing Snorri cam above the Selfie X Tilt and Y Pan, and I'll just go ahead and rename that Selfie Cam. Just like with my tripod head, I'll go ahead and parent the Selfie Cam to the Selfie X Tilt point. I'll parent the Selfie X Tilt point to the Selfie Y Pan. But, in a manner similar to the Snorri Cam, I want to go ahead and leave the Selfie Y Pan parented to the airplane object. The whole point of putting the yoke rig inside the airplane is to allow the camera to quickly and easily orbit around the object as it moves. Let's take a look at the transform controls for the Y pan point. We'll go to the first frame. I'll go ahead and activate keyframing and set the Y rotation to, we'll call it 80. I'll look at the transform controls of the X tilt point, activate keyframing on X rotation, and I'll move that to, say, 20. I'll move to the last frame of the animation, move back to the Selfie Y pan, and change that from 80 to negative 80. And I'll change the X tilt from 20 to, say, 45. Now when we scrub the timeline, the camera is smoothly rotating and arcing around our airplane as our airplane moves over our landscape. At the moment, in the viewer window, this drop-down menu is set to World. This means that the control widgets for selected objects and layers orient along the absolute axes of the 3D world. We can see this here with the Selfie X tilt point. The green arrow is aligned with the Y-axis of the Hitfilm world, while this blue arrow is aligned with the Z-axis of the Hitfilm world. I'm going to change the view mode from World to Local. When in local mode, the control widget is shown oriented to the object itself. We still have the Selfie X tilt point selected, but now we can see that this blue arrow is pointing directly at the camera, while the green arrow for Y is pointing relative up, and the red arrow for X is pointing relative right. And here's where this becomes interesting and powerful. Let me select the actual Selfie Cam layer and take a look at its transform controls. We'll take a look at the position. The Selfie Cam layer is parented to the Selfie X tilt point, which is oriented to face directly at the camera. Looking at the position controls for the Selfie Cam layer, we can see that its position is set to 0, 0, 7000. This means that is at the 0 point of the X and 0 point of the Y axes relative to the Selfie X tilt point. It is 7,000 pixels away from the Selfie X tilt point on the point's Z axis. And what this means is we can add a dynamic camera movement along with the camera rotation very easily. We'll activate the position keyframes for the Selfie Cam and change this distance from 7,000 to 12,000. We'll come to about 4 seconds in and change this from 12,000 to 2,000. Too close. That 3,500. Go to about 6 seconds and create another keyframe. We'll move to the last frame and change this back to 12,000. I'll also select all of these keyframes and change their interpolation type to smooth. And now when we scroll the playhead, we see not only is our camera rotating around our plane, it's moving closer to the plane, holding position, and then moving out again. So to sum up, this type of selfie rig is very useful for sweeping and moving cameras around a moving object while keeping that moving object centered in the frame. Note that the selfie stick is basically a circle dolly with a yoke rig attached to the pivot point. The next type of camera we're going to talk about are jibs and cranes. The terms jib and crane are pretty much used interchangeably in the industry. There's very little difference between a jib and a crane, and what that difference is debatable, depending on who you ask. In general, a jib has a single operator, while a crane would have a crew of multiple operators. But either way, a camera jib or camera crane is a long arm attached to a central pivot point to extend the range of camera motion. The arm of the jib extends outwards with the camera on the end and extends backwards to have a counterweight on the back end. As the jib moves up and down, the camera platform automatically orients to keep the camera level with the ground, and the jib arm can be rotated around the central pylon. Jibs tend to have a static camera platform, while more advanced cranes might have a camera platform that contains a yoke rig so that the camera itself can move independently of the jib arm. Jib and crane shots are used a lot in movies and TV shows. They add a lot of production value to your shot, and there's really few things like seeing a 30-foot crane starting up above a house, sweeping all the way down to street level. Like a camera tripod, the rotation of a jib or crane moves on the y-axis first and then on the x-axis. The single best crane shot in the entire history of cinema might be the opening shot of Orson Welles' 1958 movie Touch of Evil. The opening crane shot is over 3 minutes long and featured a 30-foot crane mounted on the back of a truck moving through several city blocks. This shot would still be insanely complicated to get with 2017 technology, much less 1958. So let's take a look at how to make jibs and cranes inside Hitfilm. The first step in creating a jib or a crane is to create the X-tilt and Y-pan tripod head points for the camera mount. We've already done that, so we'll just continue on. We'll duplicate the Y-pan and rename this point Counterbalance. We'll discuss what the counterbalance point does in just a moment. For now, parent the Y-pan point to the counterbalance point, and we'll duplicate the counterbalance point. We'll rename the duplicate of the counterbalance point Jib X Tilt. Let's come up to our transform controls for the Jib X Tilt point and twirl them open. We can see that the Jib X Tilt point is set to position 0, -16, 1866.6. I'm going to go ahead and change this Y from -16 back to 0. And now we'll talk scale for a moment. The scale for the scene is set to 100 pixels, equaling 1 foot. And if we take a look at our ground plane and open up its transform controls, we'll see that its position is 0, -600, 0. Now our camera itself is on the 0 line in Hitfilm's universe. With the ground being set to -600, this means that the camera is currently 6 feet above ground level. And by setting our Jib X Tilt's Y position to 0, this means that the tilt point for the jib is also 6 feet above ground level. Let's take a look at the Z position, which is currently at the default of 1866.67. We need to decide how long we want to make our jib. I want to make this jib 10 feet. 10 feet is simple. That's 1,000 pixels. So I'm going to change this position from 1866 to 2866. Then I'm going to parent the counterbalance point to the jib X tilt. I'll duplicate jib X tilt, rename this to jib Y pan, and parent jib X tilt to the Y pan point. I'll duplicate jib Y pan, and I'm going to rename this jib move point. I'm going to move to the jib move point, open up its transform settings, and set its Y to -600. This places the move point even with the ground plane. You don't have to put your move point on the ground plane. I just kind of like to do that myself. In this particular scene, my ground is a single flat plane. There's no hills, there's no dips, there's no rise to the ground. But by locking the move point for the camera rig to the ground plane, as I move the camera around, it makes it easier to have the camera move with the surface of the ground if there were dips, rises, etc., by having that locked to the position of the ground point. For now, we need to parent the jib Y pan to the jib move point. Now, this is a little bit hard to visualize, so we're going to turn on this top layer called Observation Camera. This observation camera is not intended as an active camera within the scene. This observation camera is used so that I can observe parts of my setup within the scene. I'm using a Hitfilm camera as an observation camera rather than shifting to the perspective view because the perspective view's camera does not show 2D effects. And we're about to use some of those. Let's create a new grade layer. Open up the effects panel and type in lightning. I'll drag a lightning and electricity effect to the grade layer, and I'm going to adjust this lightning to have 0 wave scale and 0 twitch. I'll also take the quantity of branches down to 0. And I'll go ahead and turn the opacity of the glow down to 0. And set the end width to 1. This gives me a plain white line. Let's change the start point of this line to our 35mm camera, set the position to 0, 0, and we'll change the end point of our line to our X tilt point and change that to 0, 0. I'll close this lightning and electricity effect and name this tripod head. I'm going to duplicate the tripod head lightning effect, change the start point to the X tilt, change the end point to go to the jib X tilt, and rename that to jib arm. I'll duplicate the jib arm lightning effect, twirl that open, change the start point to the jib X tilt, and change the end point to the jib move point. I'll rename this jib pylon. I'm going to quickly come up and create another 3D point, and I'm just going to go ahead and name that pointer. I'll parent the pointer point to the 35mm camera itself, return to my grade layer, and I'm going to duplicate this jib pylon electricity one more time. I'll change the start point to the 35mm camera. I'm going to change the end point to the pointer point. I'm going to go ahead and change the core color on this one from white to red, just so it has a different look. And what we've created here is a simplified animation skeleton rig like we discussed back in How to Animate Everything Part 3. If I zoom in, we can see a small white line extending from the camera down to its X pivot point. This next white line represents the jib arm itself. And this white line just connects the jib to its move point, while the red line points towards wherever the camera's looking at. Let's create a camera movement. First, I'll come up to the jib Y pan, twirl open the transform controls, and I think I'm going to go ahead and set the Y rotation to -20. I'll activate keyframing and move to the last frame of the animation. Change the Y rotation to 20. I'll return to the first frame, come to the jib X tilt point, and activate keyframing on the X axis. I'll set the X rotation to 10 degrees, move to the last frame, and change the X rotation to -60. Now when I drag the playhead, we can start to see a problem. The red line that represents the direction the camera is looking at is moving with the jib arm. Our camera is started pointing towards the ground and ends pointed towards the sky. This isn't what we want. A real jib would keep the camera level all the way through the move. And this is what the counterbalance point is for. I'll open up the jib X tilt point and select both of the keyframes we created, and copy those. I'll open up the counterbalance point, activate its X rotation, and then paste those keyframes in. The counterbalance point should have its X rotation set to be negative, or the inverse value of whatever points are entered in the jib X tilt point. So I'll just change this first keyframe, which is 10, to -10. I'll grab the second counterbalance keyframe, and I'll change that from -60 to 60. And now in the viewer window you can see, as we drag the playhead, as the jib moves, the camera itself is staying level with the ground. We'll turn the grade layer off and then turn off our observation camera. This takes us back to our 35mm camera currently attached to the jib. And when we play this back, we have a very smooth and very accurate jib movement. I've gone ahead and reset my jib rotation. We're going to do another crane move. I'm going to go ahead and activate position keyframing on the jib move point. And I'm going to move my jib off into the distance. Skip to the last frame. Pull the jib back. Go back to the first frame. Activate the jib X tilt. Take it back down to about 30. Go back to the last frame. I'll set that jib again to -60. Copy the jib X tilt points. Activate X rotation on my counterbalance. Return to the first frame. Paste those keyframes in. Invert them. So -30, 60. And I'll select all of my keyframes and convert them to smooth. Do that with the move point as well. Turn the observation camera off. And here's our completed jib move. I'm going to go ahead and do one more of these. I've put my playhead on the last frame of the animation. And what I want to do is have my camera start high and end up low behind this police car. And I'll just set that up quickly. I'm going to work from the last frame to the first frame. So I'll start with my jib move point. Turn the observation camera off. When creating this shot, I started with the movement of the jib pylon. The entire camera rig slides to the right over the duration of the shot. Then I went back and adjusted the horizontal rotation of the jib arm before adjusting the vertical sweep of the jib arm. And of course, adjusting the counterbalance. Finally, I went back and animated the yoke rig on the camera platform so that the camera head itself animates. There's no right or wrong way or particular order to go around animating this type of crane shot. And here's what that jib move looks like. I've changed the camera lens from a 35mm equivalent to an 18mm equivalent to have a little bit more wide angle. It's a dynamic move that has a very cinematic feel, is moving very realistically compared to an actual camera, and it's the type of move that would be almost impossible to pull off by directly animating the camera. We'll move to the observation camera and take a look at the skeleton rig so we can better see what the jib is doing. I've modified my skeleton grade layer slightly to make that easier to see. The blue line is still the jib pylon, stretching from the floor to the head. The white line is still the jib arm itself, and the red line still shows where the camera is pointing. As we move the playhead, we can see that the entire jib rig is sliding sideways. The jib arm is tilting down and rotating, while the camera itself pans and tilts on its own tripod head. When animating in Hitfilm, probably about 9 times out of 10, it's better to use some of the rigs and techniques we've discussed in this episode rather than directly move the camera itself. By getting comfortable with the techniques and rigs we've discussed here, you'll be able to have your camera do all kinds of smooth and dynamic moves within your virtual Hitfilm world, moves that would be nearly impossible to animate by moving the Hitfilm camera itself. And we're not done yet. There's actually one more part of this camera tutorial, which will cover handheld camera motion, camera shake, lens distortion, and we might even take a look at something that you don't normally think about doing in Hitfilm. I'd like to thank you for sitting through this tutorial. I'm Mike Miller from Tri-M Visual, and I'll see you next time.